Welcome to this session on measuring impact. So that's what we're looking at today. My name is David Page. I'm from Triceratops Training, which is a bit tricky to say, especially if you've had a few too many cups of coffee this morning. And we're a small organization and we exist to support other small organizations in the third sector, charitable organizations, we call them. And we do them through training like this. But we also do one-to-one support of organizations. And that there's lots of different things that we do, but generally it falls into two categories. Fundraising, of course, everybody needs help with a bit of fundraising. But also in helping organizations understand the impact that they have. And I have to say, that's my favorite thing to do, because small organizations create so much goodness and they bring so much positive change into the world. And we often get overlooked in favor of the big charities. But let's not get political on this. But it's really lovely to see folks that I work with where the penny just drops and they suddenly realize, oh, I'm actually a valuable human because you contribute to the changes that your organization makes. And so what we're going to do over the next hour, and it's going to be a whirlwind because we've got a fair bit to get through, is we're going to look at how we can build up a framework to let us measure and understand the impact that we have. Now, let's go and let me share my screen in true online training fashion. So hopefully you are able to see that. There we go. Let's skip over housekeeping and let's go straight into the session overview of where we're going to go today. So unfortunately, there is some unescapable jargon that we need to wrestle with, and we will introduce that and hit that the nail on the head of that straight away. And we'll go over it again as the session progresses because there's no escaping from it. And then we're going to go into thinking about what is called a theory of change. And yes, I know that's jargon, but you'll know what that means by the time we get to this bit of the session. And we're going to have a look at different options that are there for you. And then we're going to go through a step-by-step approach of how you may want to look at building up a theory of change that's going to unlock this understanding for you. And then we'll conclude it at the end. So let's go and jump right in then with a bit of busting jargon. Now, monitoring and evaluation are part of this thing that we call impact. Now, for the purposes of today, when you hear the word impact, I want you to hear the words the big change. Because when we're saying impact, we're talking about the overall change that you create as a result of your efforts in your organizations. So the impact is the big change. We've got impact practice, and that's all of the stuff that you do underneath that kind of title of the big change. And then we get to a little bit of a confusing part. We've got this word outcomes. Now, outcomes are also changes, but they're not your big change. They're smaller changes. And lots of outcomes, lots of smaller changes will add up to create your impact. The smaller changes add up to create the big change. Outputs is a very similar word, and there's always confusion between these two, but outputs are numbers. Let's get that locked away. They're numbers. And we can clarify that again later on. If there are any questions or anything you need me to clarify, please do use the chat. I can't see it at the moment, but we'll see if we can make a bit of space for it at the end of the session. Activities, well, that's the charitable things that you do. That's nice and clear. And then we've got this last bullet point on this slide, the theory of change. And as we've said on here, I think the best way to think of a theory of change is to think of a map. We have one of these to map out all of the bits, all of our impact practice that leads to our impact. You might also want to think of it as maybe a guide or a story of your organization. And actually the idea that it should be coherent and it should have a narrative is really going to make this very useful for you when it comes to fundraising, when it comes to internal decision making, when it comes to finding new trustees and new volunteers, maybe even when it comes to retaining staff, if you've got staff, or attracting new folks that you can help who are going to come along and be the next wave of beneficiaries or clients or service users or communities that you work with, however you term it in your organization. So, quick run through of the jargon, and you can flick back to this slide should you need to check it again or remind yourself again. So we've got this theory of change. That's what we're going to be talking about mainly today. And so this kind of map, this story of our organization. And there's, of course, different ways you can go about doing it. Lots of different ways, actually. I'm going to introduce you very briefly to 3 different ways, very briefly. And then we're going to go and look at one of those ways and follow the process through how we're going to create it. And the process is similar no matter which of these ways that you choose. So, number 1, the Charity Evaluation Services Planning Triangle. If you are completely brand new to this and you work for what we could call a fairly streamlined, like a fairly simple organization, simple as in maybe you only do 1 or 2 projects, then this might be for you, because it is the easiest of all of them to pull it together. Actually, if you're sitting down in a room of folks who are in your team, then you might be able to come up and complete this in a couple of hours. As long as you're all on the same page, that is. So let's have a little look at what this tells us. Well, let's start at the bottom. And this tells us the activities, because unless we do activities, no change comes about, does it? So they're at the bottom of the pyramid. And then we go up and we've got our outcomes. Remember, outcomes were those smaller changes that add up together to give our big change, which is the impact. And you can see how it kind of flows up. It's got that visual representation of a pyramid. You know, we're trying to get to the top. Another good thing about this is the fact that it is visual, and so it appeals to people who have that kind of wiring going on in their brain. And also, the top of the pyramid is quite small. And so that's a kind of, it's a prompt to say that when we're describing our overall impact, we're looking at something short, concise, snappy, and hopefully memorable. It's to be no more than a sentence. It should really just be a statement. And the planning triangle keeps that in mind. And impacts, if we're describing our impact with different paragraphs, nobody's going to read it. We want something that's going to engage people, engage our staff, engage our trustees, engage potential donors that are out there. So this is a really straightforward place to start, actually. But it doesn't quite go far enough for most organizations. For example, it doesn't tell us which activities are linked to which outcomes. You'll know if you run more than one activity in your organizations that you'll get different positive changes for people from different activities. Of course you do. That's natural. But this doesn't show us if there's any correlation or link between the activities and the outcomes. It also doesn't let us know if any of the activities or any of the outcomes need to happen in a particular order. And so it doesn't help us to articulate the journey maybe as well as we would like. But it is a really good place to be starting. Let's go on and I'll show you another framework. This is what I call a log frame. Sometimes it's called the logic model. And it's called a logic model because it's very logical. And actually, because of that, when I'm supporting organizations one-on-one to build these frameworks, we use this log frame, this logical model, because it's easier and makes sense to work through. And you'll be delighted to know that this is what we're going to be filling out throughout this session. And you can see it allows for a bit of customization, and it gives us a clearer idea of the flow from the activity through the outcomes to the impact, because we've got space to spread it out. We've got more space to work with. We have customized it as well. Look, we've got now, instead of just outcomes, we've got short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. And I'm sure you know that some of the positive changes that your activities have provide short, required, meaningful changes for people, benefits for people, you might want to say. But then other projects maybe have much longer lingering benefits. My hope for this session for you is that straight away after, you're going to feel that you've got a bit of increased knowledge and, well, increased confidence when it comes to this idea of measuring and mapping out your impact. But my long-term outcomes is that you can do that and implement it and have a more sustainable or a more resilient organization at the end of it. Or even just get that kind of long-term reassurance that the stress you put up with is actually worth it, because you are making the world a better place, because you've proved it to yourself. And there's lots of different places you can take to customize this, but we won't go into that in much detail just now. So we've got the log frame or the logic model. Now, there's a problem with this one, and that it is really boring to look at because it's a table, and that might not chime with everybody. So let's have a look at a different one. This is the outcomes chain. Now, I'm doing this project at the moment with a theatre group, and we're building it using the log frame, but they're creatives and they are much used to presenting things visually. And the outcomes chain allows us to do that. It allows us to play around with it. And you're looking at this and you're thinking, Dave, that's still really ugly. And it is. But the reason why this is an ugly one is because this is what it's going to look like when you're in the midst of creating it. At the end, you get to polish it and make it look lovely. But at the moment, when you're building it, it's going to look all over the place. But you're going to know where every single thing is and why it's where it is. And you're going to see the flow. And actually, the flow is easier to see on the outcomes chain than it was on the log frame. And it was easier to see definitely than it was on the CES planning triangle. You know, we can see our activities unlock outcomes, but there's a journey of following those arrows that go through. That could be something that you do. In practice, the log frame tends to be where I create them, but then it gets translated into an outcomes chain just to help accessibility. And actually, that whole idea of accessibility is really quite important when you're thinking about how you want, or which one you want to choose, sorry. Who is going to be involved in building this, and who is that one main audience you're building it for? Is it for your internal decision makers? Is it for funders? Is it for donors? Different audiences. And having the one purpose in mind for building this is going to help you do it a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. You need to do a little bit of translation on the end if you want to share it with different audiences for different purposes, yes. But all of the hard work that goes in is going to be much more streamlined if you just choose one purpose, one audience. The CES planning triangle is no use if you've got lots of different activities, or maybe different like departments of activities. It's too simplistic for that. So you need to consider the size of your organization, the complexity of your organization. Even it's a good idea to have a quick think about just the volume of changes that you might have. We'll be talking about that again in a minute. But all of these things are important to consider when you're choosing the framework that resonates best with you. Now, I would say also listen to your gut. Which one do you just feel is the best fit? Because probably, especially if you're going to be putting in the brunt of work to do this, probably that's the best one to start with. So, talking about starting, why don't we have a look at a step-by-step approach for populating and working through the log frame model? This is the learning cycle, which we've adapted slightly from its original, which was created by the NCVO, and I've renamed it into the impact cycle. And this is kind of the process that you want to go through when you are thinking of mapping out your impact. We're going to walk around this, and it's hopefully going to give you a clear idea of how to do this using the log frame. And if you want to use the log frame, brilliant. But it also works for the other models as well. So where's our first step? Well, a first step that we need to do actually falls into the planning category. And you can't do it in isolation. You need to involve other people in this project. And that's because it needs to be informed by different perspectives. You can get really useful insight, information, and data in the process of building this up when you consult with other stakeholders, you know, especially actually the current perspectives of your service users, of your beneficiaries, of the communities that you're working with, that group of people. To do that, you can hold focus groups, you can do interviews, you can issue out surveys, or just go and ask for specific feedback by email. What getting these diverse perspectives is going to do, it's going to help you understand the needs and the opportunities and the barriers that are part and parcel of the impact that you're delivering. You can also involve other people at different stages, and it can be really helpful to sense check your thinking, to sense check your kind of decisions, to sense check your priorities by bringing in others and asking them to get involved as well. We don't want to make assumptions here. Well, let's clarify that. We are going to make assumptions, but we want those assumptions that we're making to be as small as possible. And engaging other people and getting their insight on what you're doing, listening to them, figuring out if it's worth listening to them, is going to help you reduce and narrow down those assumptions to as small as they can be. Okay, so we've got our log frame. And we need to start by thinking, well, what is the problem that we are trying to address? We don't actually write that in our log frame. But what we're thinking of here is, what is the need that we are looking at meeting? Is it a root cause? Like, is it something like childhood trauma, or a failure in the system or the structure of society? Is it a kind of a slightly different level, like a knock-on problem or need that we're trying to fill, like homelessness would be an example of that? Or is it an effect of a problem that we're trying to help? Think about cancer as a need. There are very few charities that try and address the full spectrum of need around cancer. But you've got folks like Macmillan who look after folks and families who have cancer. You've got folks like the Beatson in Glasgow, who look at seeing if they can cure cancer once people have it. And then you've got organisations like Prevent Breast Cancer, who through education and awareness are trying to stop people getting cancer in the first place. Root, like a tree, a root, a trunk, or the leaves at the top. Understanding where you come in people's big long stories and understanding the need that you're giving. That's the first thing that you need to do. And I'm going to hope and assume that actually you already do know that. But then what we need to do is we need to think of, right, what is that big change that we're creating? in the context of that need that we're meeting, what is the big change? And that's actually where we start. If we have a look at our log frame model, we don't start with the activities. We start by filling in the column on the impact, the big change. And the reason we do that is really quite simple. As a charity, you exist to make the world a better place. You don't exist to do things. You exist to bring around positive change. That's why you exist. That's the ultimate reason that you exist. And activities fluctuate. They come and they go, and they're not as important as the change that's being created. And so we have to start by defining what that change is. And there's probably, if you have a look at your annual accounts or you talk to the folks who are in leadership of your organization, or if you're a charity, your memorandums and articles of association, you'll get a lot of idea of what that change is from those core founding essential documents that you have. This is hard to get right. And it takes a while to get right as well. But you don't need to get it 100% perfect, because this is a work in progress. You just need something that's good enough. That talks about the change. So as you can see here in our example that we're using, based on a real life piece of work that happened, their impact statement, the first thing we write down is improved education, health and well-being for women and girls. It doesn't talk about what they're doing. It talks about what they're achieving, what they're changing. So that's where we start. Next, then, we go and think about the activities. And activities are the things that you do. If you do lots and lots and lots of different activities, you might want to group them together to just make it easier to handle. If you're doing this for the first time, just think about the direct charitable activities that you're doing. But if you've maybe done this and you've got a bit of experience behind it, you can actually extend it to think of your back office duties as well. There is a strategic value in doing that, but don't do that if this is your first time through. That's kind of like extension activity. That's like level 3 or 4 or something. We're working on level 1 at the moment. So what are the projects you're running? That tends to be quite easy to fill in. That tends to happen very, very simply. I did go into an organization once. I was talking to them this morning, actually, and we were doing quite a long piece of work together. And I said, so what activities do you run then? Because we need to put them down. And they said, you mean all 312 activities that we run each year? And I said, no. And then ensued a big conversation about how to group them. And I've worked with organizations that have grouped them in in themes of the main changes that happen. I've worked with organizations that group them due to the locations that the projects happen. I did one which was projects in the office, projects in the park, projects at the leisure centre. It worked for that charity. Maybe it will work for you, but don't be afraid to group them if it's going to make it easier for you to deal with. Because the next bit is pretty involved. This is where we start getting some real meat on the bones, as it were. What is it that you're thinking about measuring? So the textbook approach says that you start with what's easy for you to figure out, and that tends to be the numbers, the outputs. We're not thinking about how you're going to measure them, just what numbers and what outputs it would be nice to collect. I don't do it in the textbook way. And that's because there's a lot more richness to be discovered in this activity than numbers. And if we start with numbers, we kind of trick ourselves into thinking numbers are going to do the job for us. They don't. Outcomes, those changes, they're never numbers. Numbers support them. Numbers can describe how many of these changes have gone on, or maybe even how deep these changes actually are. But it's the changes that are going to tell this story for us. They're going to make up an understanding as we're mapping things out. So in my projects, I think, right, let's talk about that activity. What are the 3 main changes you see in that activity? Just 3. It's magic number 3. It really is. Now, what happens is the folks that I work with don't listen to me and they come up with 5 or 7 or something like that. But the more you come up with, the more work you're giving yourself. So if you can keep it to 3, that would be my advice. 3 big changes. And you go through your different activities, thinking about those, what are those 3 big changes for each activity? And what you'll most likely find is that 2 of those activities at least ring true for just about all of your activities. And they're really good indications that those are the most important changes. So if we're talking about outcomes, let me give you some examples of changes that you might be seeing. So outcomes, it's all about change, the engine of change, we've called this slide. So changes, as we've kind of already covered, can be long-term or they can be short-term. One isn't necessarily better than the other. It depends on your organization and how you are. Changes can be hard or soft. So an example of a hard outcome would be, did that person get a job? Yes or no? Did they reoffend? Yes or no? That's a hard outcome. But most of our outcomes are a bit more tricky to quantify, and they're soft changes that are less binary. Did their self-esteem improve? Well, yes, it did, but we need to explain how we have come to that conclusion because we don't have a job slip to prove it. Did somebody's aspirations for their family increase? That's a soft outcome. It's much more interesting, but harder to quantify. Either of those can be okay. A mix of them, that's on point. Outcomes can be intended or unintended. Right, story time. There's a charity that I'm planning to do a bit of work with next year, and they were telling me a story. They work in Ghana mainly, and one of their projects that they used to run was they took old bicycles from the UK, refurbished them and shipped them out to Ghana. Now, the reason they did that is because they gave those bicycles to young people, to school pupils, because in rural Ghana, you've got your one central school, which serves lots of satellite villages. And sometimes those satellite villages are a 2-hour walk away from the school. And, people don't have cars and getting there's the challenge. So give the kids bikes, they can get to school. Absolutely brilliant. So they did it and they tried it for a month. But what they found was that school attendance actually dropped instead of increasing, as was the plan. Now, it's quite a level-headed organization. It's one of these ones that's kind of equal. In fact, it's more run in Ghana than it is in the UK now, which is really wonderful. And they didn't panic, but what they did is they went to the school gates to see if they could figure out what was going on. And it turned out what was happening, which was a totally unintended outcome, was that the pupils who had been given the bikes were actually doing shuttle runs to and from the village to take other kids from the village who hadn't been given bikes to school. And it was simply a case that the school didn't have the facility to mark students down as being late. They were either there when the bell went or they were marked as absent. And so a little chat with the school to say, could we possibly have, kids come to the office before going to the classes, or teachers mark it down, showed that actually there was a massive unintended benefit. And, it wasn't a benefit of one bike to one individual, it was a benefit of one bike to about 6 individuals. Brilliant unintended outcome. But your unintended outcomes can marry up with the next bullet point as well. They can be negative or positive. Sometimes we can have changes that are actually negative. Usually when those are happening, it's because we don't know they're happening, but they might happen. We might, in our support for somebody, be fracturing a family, for example. That might be a negative consequence. There was a big NGO back in the 70s who was digging wells. And they didn't realize that they were actually digging through heavy metal deposits. And they didn't realize that for 20 years. So they've been slowly actually poisoning the communities that they were trying to help. And they had helped by bringing that water, but it wasn't clean water. And that's a negative outcome. And, they went in and they fixed that, which is great. But there was still that unavoidable negative outcome. keeping your eyes open for negative outcomes. It's really important because if you want to see them and you can nip them in the bud, that's a brilliant way of improving what you're doing. We've kind of talked about changes might happen in sequences, but sometimes, and if you work with people, you'll probably realize this. If our kind of journey of change goes A, B, C, and D, it's very rare that we have someone coming to us and them actually going A, B, C, D. They usually go A, B, C, and then we're back to B for a while, and then we're at C, and then we might make it to D, and then a few months later they come back in at B again, go back to A, and it then doesn't happen in a straight line. And that's part of the fun of it, right enough. So it's important to realize that that is a factor that may happen as well as you're looking at the changes that you're going through. So when you're thinking about your outcomes and your outputs, that's when your model suddenly comes to life. We've got these numbers that we want to collect, the outputs. This organization has decided to split up their outcomes into short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. And all of that feeds in to the impact. Here's the other view of it. So step one, well, that was not to do it alone and to start gathering the insights of other folks. Step two, that's the pink bit, coming up with your impact. What is that big impact? Step three, going and mapping and thinking about your activities, grouping them if you need to. And then step four, it feels a bit like, you know, that thing where they draw a couple of circles and then say the next step is just to draw the rest of the owl. And it feels a bit like that when you look at it like this. But actually what happens is step four, when you're coming up with those changes and you're thinking about those numbers that can go behind those changes, it's a really wonderful unifying discussion to get into with other folks in your organization. It gives you a sense of unity. It gives you a sense of direction, and actually, yeah, it's a really, really wonderful thing to do, but it does involve a fair bit of chat and a fair bit of work, and also a fair bit of prioritization. If we're aiming for 3 changes for each activity and you've got 15 changes, something needs to be done. Now I just want to go on a little extra little tangent. Sometimes your outcomes can in themselves be still a really big claim to make. So our impact statement is always a big claim to make. And we've got our outcomes underneath that, which, you know, track up to prove that. But sometimes our outcomes are still too big. And you can, if it makes life easier for you, break your outcomes down into like mini outcomes. We call them indicators, but mini outcomes, sub outcomes could work for as well, just for a name. And the idea is the same, that those mini outcomes are easier to measure. They're easier to quantify. And they add together to the outcomes, which all then come and add together to your impact. If you want to customize your log frame to include those indicators, those mini outcomes, then by all means do that. The only problem is you're giving yourself more work, because if you've got 3 indicators for each of the 3 outcomes, you suddenly got 9 things that you need to try and measure and keep track of instead of just 3. It might make life easier, but it might not. And only you can really make that call by giving it a whirl and trying it. So we're just going to press a really big fast forward button now, and we're just going to assume that you've done that. I've done that with organizations within a month. I've got 1 client at the moment, and we are nearly 2 years into doing it. That's not because it's especially complicated, but it's because it's not on their priority list. If you prioritize it, you can get through it fairly efficiently and fairly quickly. But then what do we do with it? Because as I said, if we're doing a log frame, it's really quite ugly, isn't it? And this is where we start thinking about, right, how are we going to turn this into something useful for the organization as a whole, not just for me and the other little folks who are in your little group pulling this together? To change it from something that only you understand into something pretty often means that you can cut out a lot of the waffle. Keep that because you're going to refer back to it. But this is an example of how an organization set out their findings for an internal audience. This is from an organization called EcoActive. Um, and they categorized their activities and actually their sub outcomes into these 4 outcomes, which added up to their overall impact, and just laid it out as simply as this, because that's all their trustees needed to see the value of it. These are the changes that we make in these different categories. That might be useful for trustees, but it's not really very attractive for external audiences, is there? And when I said the theory of change, it's quite a fashionable kind of element or statement at the moment, a theory of change, our theory of change. And this might have been more the thing that popped into your head, a graphical representation of that journey. And there's a couple of ones that we've taken here. We see the one in the background here is a theory of change that's very word heavy. That might suit your audiences. This other one from Purposeful, which is slightly in the foreground on the right of the screen, that is much more graphical, much more visual, to draw people in. The Co-op Foundation, as in the cooperative, their theory of change is a 16-page PDF document, because they work in the corporate world and they like doing long nonsense documents in the corporate world. In essence, this theory of change is a story. It's a narrative, and you can present it as such as well. Part of the activities I do is getting the charities to describe their log frame as a story of an individual coming through the organization, if that's beneficial. But using it in this kind of graphical way seems to be the trend at the moment. My advice would be, if you are doing it for public consumption, talk to somebody who's good at graphic design. Don't try and do it yourself in Publisher, because it will look a bit naff. And there are no rules. You can use as many numbers as you want. You can use real photos if you want. You can use real statistics, real stories in there if you want, or you don't have to. It's entirely depending on what you think it could unlock. If you're taking this a little bit further, there are enabling factors that need to come into play if you're going to be able to deliver this change that you're currently claiming that you're making. Those factors might be, maybe people do need to follow a set journey, or they need to get to a certain level of change before you can move them on to like the next chapter of their engagement with you. Or it might be something completely different. You might have an enabling factor of, you need somebody who speaks a specific language, or you need the atmosphere of your organization to be warm and engaging, whether that's physically or non-physically. And that doesn't have really any room on the log frame for that. But it is something that should come through, and you'll find as you're discussing those changes that you naturally start discussing, well, what do we need in place for this to happen? Facilities do we need? What individuals do we need? What skills do we need? What aptitudes do we need? So take a note of it, because it's going to be rich and it's going to help your understanding further. You don't have to. This is like an extension activity, but you do have to do the next bit. We make assumptions. And as we said at the start, we want those assumptions to be as small as possible. So let's just flick back to our completed log frame. There we go. So we've put this together and we've said that, oh, let's choose a random outcome. Teachers are more supportive of girls during their periods. We're asserting that. We're not proving it, but you need to prove it. For every outcome or every sub-outcome, if you're doing it, and for every output, so every number that you're saying you would like to collect it, there needs to be a mechanism or a methodology behind it of how you're going to prove that. Teachers are more supportive of girls during periods. How on earth are you going to find that out? You're going to talk to teachers? Well, every teacher is going to say, yes, I am, especially the male teachers who you're engaging with, probably. You're going to talk to the girls? Well, you need to be sensitive in how you're going to do that. So do you want to do it in person or do you want to maybe do it anonymously? And what you really should be doing if you want to bring this from a place of maybe slight fiction into a place of reality where you are actually properly proving to yourself that these changes are happening through your organization, then you might want to add in a couple of extra columns that says evidence. What methodologies are we going to put in? What forms are people going to be filling in? What videos and photos are we collecting that's going to prove this? It's going to prove this change actually happens, that can provide evidence if anybody says to us, well, how do you know that happens? That takes ages. You'll likely have a framework of collecting evidence already, and most of the outcomes will probably fit into that framework somehow. With a bit of shoehorning, they'll probably go in. But I'm yet to come across an organization that can tick off every single outcome through their current impact practice, what they're using, the methods that they're using to measure things. So give yourself a bit of grace. You can go and build that, a graphical theory of change, without having that proof in place, or with only having part of that proof in place. You can do that. But you want to be coming from a place of full authority and saying, actually, we can prove every single one of these things that we are claiming within reasonable doubt. Give yourself the grace of a year or two, actually, especially if you've got lots of different activities and you've got lots of different outcomes and changes, to get all of that in place. Or go at it whole hog and try and get it done as soon as you can. So that's just kind of coming to the end. I told you it was a whirlwind tour. I've just got some final tips for you. When it comes to choosing that framework, just think about what's going to work for you. And then after that, think about what's going to work for your partners, for your beneficiaries, folks like that. If you go with what resonates with you, then you've got more chance of actually engaging with it and moving it on to completion. That's just a state of play. So choose a framework that works with you. Remember as well that change, as you say here, doesn't happen in isolation. Each change feeds on the other changes that you're got. It's a momentum game, isn't it, that we play quite often. And just because people experience one change doesn't mean that they're going to experience all of the changes, but that's okay, because we're looking for the biggest changes overall for everybody. And the last one is really do involve others in the process when you're developing. We said here, when developing and implementing your impact measurement, talking to the folks who are experiencing these changes, talking to the folks who are creating these changes or witnessing these changes in others firsthand, they're going to give you much better insight than if you're just to sit down and try and do it on your own. It's been really interesting doing a bit of work with an organization, because through this activity, they have discovered that they're not the organization that they thought they were. They thought they were an arts organization, but actually what they are is a community building organization. And it's been a very slow process bringing them through that. But the realization there is really wonderful, and it's really strong, because now they actually have that identity that, yeah, they're all creatives. They do community choirs and lots of different things like that. But actually, they're more about building community through the use of art than building art through the use of community. And for them, that's a really big thing. It's a really wonderful discovery for them. And it's been a joy to work through that. There's nothing quite like seeing the penny drop with folks, because quite often it's easier to see the change that you're making from an external perspective than it is to do it when you're in the woods, as it were. If you want any more resources on this, we've got, we can help you at Triceratops Training. Of course, we can have a conversation with Sabs as well. But there are these other places that you can go to find out a bit more about building a theory of change. Just be warned that it can get quite complicated quite quickly for those organizations that are out there providing support, but the support that's not aimed at small organization. So where have we gone? Well, we had that idea. Well, we covered those jargons first, didn't we? Well, we tried to anyway. And if they're still jargon to you, don't worry. They're still jargon to me sometimes as well. And I have to remind myself, especially outputs and outcomes, that they just get muddled up in my head. But we talked about that first of all. And then we had a little look at, if we are looking at measuring our impact, we need to have a framework underneath so we know what we're actually trying to measure. And we're doing that by mapping it out through different theory of change models. And then we took that step-by-step approach, working around that impact cycle that we had for how to put that together. And then we just talked about a few bits and bobs at the end, didn't we? So that is our session. There we go. I'm just trying to figure out how I stop sharing my screen in Microsoft Teams, and I can't figure it out. Are there any questions that have been asked? Where are we? There we go. Are there any questions that have been asked in the chat that I've maybe not seen, or would anybody like to unmute themselves and ask a question? If we can maybe stop recording or carry on recording, I don't know what we want to do that. So feel free to ask away. And an awkward silence descends. That's a good sign. That's a lovely sign. See if you're lying awake in your bed at 2:00 in the morning thinking, oh, I can't believe I didn't ask Dave that. Or if you're watching this on record as well, my email address is david@triceratopstraining.co.uk. Please do get in touch and ask. I love it when folks get in touch. My LinkedIn is /Page David Page, Page, and you can find me on there as well. So that brings us really to the end of the session. We're 10 minutes in hand. That's quite nice. The pressure now is over to you, I'm afraid, because you remember that long-term outcome that I had of you taking what's been said today and building and using it to increase the resilience and the sustainability of your organizations. I can't do that for you, I'm afraid, but I really, really hope that you can take this away, mull it over, and see if it is useful to implement in your organizations for where you are at the moment. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. That's great.